प्रथम किरण आने से पहले पुण्य प्रभाति गाए। जागो जग जीवन जननायक, वसुधा तुम्हें जगाए। वसुधा तुम्हें जगाए। दिन जाए दिन आए, दिन जाए दिन आए। उषा काल जब नए दिवस का उज्ज्वल सूर्य उगाए। जल देकर जीवन दाता को सविनय शीश झुकाए। सविनय शीश झुकाए। दिन जाए दिन आए, दिन जाए दिन आए। उस दिन की क्या गिनती, जो दिन भजन किए बिन जाए। दिन जाए दिन आए, दिन जाए दिन आए।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. This bhajan in the melodious voice of Arunima, who was accompanied on the guitar by her brother Aditya, is about the importance of remembering the name of the Lord, the name of the divine throughout the day. And the song says that that day is a sort of a waste on which we do not remember the name of the Lord. Now, this raises two questions. Should we spend the whole day just reciting the name of the Lord? And secondly, why is it important? To the first question, whether we should spend the whole day remembering the divine, reciting the name of the divine, the answer would be that probably not. The idea is that we should be aware of the divine throughout the day. And to ensure that, at least what we can do is before we start anything new or at the end of something, we recite the name, whether it is starting a new class like today, or whether it is starting a meal. Whatever we start reciting the name, and at the end we recite the name. And if we are aware while doing the work will be done in the spirit of karma yoga, the quality of the work would improve, and so on and so forth. So while doing the work, we can get totally absorbed in the work, and we'll get absorbed and we'll do the work to the best of our ability if we keep in mind that this is working for the divine and this work has to be offered to the divine. So we don't have to do it throughout the day. In fact, that would not be the best way to spend the day for most of us, and the divine doesn't expect that. Secondly, why should we recite the name of the divine at all? Is it to satisfy the vanity of the divine, to please him because we are reciting the name of the divine? No, the divine actually has no such vanity. It's in our own interest to recite the name of the divine frequently enough to be aware of it throughout the day and night. And that awareness makes us firstly have a sense of gratitude for everything that is going on. And also prevents us from doing something unbecoming of us, unbecoming of being offered to the divine, unbecoming of something which the divine watches us saying. So it is to improve that awareness the divine is always watching us that is important, because we don't do anything wrong in the presence of someone whom we respect. For example, a young boy does not smoke in front of his father. Even if he has started smoking, he doesn't do it in front of his father. Now, here it is the Father of the universe who is watching us all the time. And therefore, we would not do something which would not be appropriate, which would be unbecoming of us, unbecoming of, unfit to be done in the presence of the divine while it is watching us. And the divine is watching us all the time. And that's why Sri Aurobindo said that behave as if the mother is always watching you. You know, we can always relate to the divine in a human figure. And the devotees of Sri Aurobindo and the mother have a tendency to see the divine in the mother, and therefore he said, behave as if the mother is always watching you. Because then, you know, you would be conscious of that, you would not do anything unbecoming. And while doing the work, your work will be done in a different spirit. Now, coming to today's session, which is on the cardiovascular system, we saw that the basic function of every part of the body is to provide the right environment to the cells. The trillions of cells that we have exacting requirements, very similar to the single-celled organisms. These cells should have food available in their vicinity, oxygen available, and the waste products should not accumulate. Now, to ensure that in that little private pond that each cell has around it, it is important that not only the this fluid surrounding the cells, this private pond of each cell, exchange food and oxygen and the waste products, etc., with the blood. But it's also important that this blood should be moving, so that fresh blood with fresh oxygen and food is coming along and carrying the waste products away. Now, to ensure this movement, we need a pump, and that pump is the heart. And that is what we shall study today, the heart. And of course, the heart has to have a network of tubes or pipes to distribute that blood all over the body and then receive it back when it returns from those parts of the body. I don't know how many of you have actually seen a real heart inside a person when the chest has been opened up. But I'm sure most of you have seen an X-ray of the chest, and that X-ray, as you know, looks somewhat like this.
You have to share the screen. We still can't see the screen.
Sorry. Now you can see it, isn't it?
Yes, we can see it now.
This doesn't really look like the heart. This is a little closer to what it really looks like. So you see in the X-ray of the chest, which looks a bit like this, the heart is here, and you have lungs on either side, and this is the right lung. This is the left lung. The heart is on the left side, and it may appear the opposite, but that is because we are not looking at our own heart. We are looking at the heart of somebody in front of us, and therefore we see a mirror image, and therefore the left side of that person is on our right hand side, and that is how the X-ray looks, and that is how the drawings, etc., in medical literature are drawn. So throughout the day today, what we'll be doing is we'll be drawing the left side on this side and the right side on this side, and that is how you see the heart within the, and you have this concavity under which is the abdomen. On the right side, the partition is pushed up by the liver, and on the left side by the stomach. So now let us see what says. We draw a group of cells here. And these cells have to have a bit of fluid around them. And this fluid in turn is in equilibrium with the blood, and the arrangement is such that instead of a tube, I'll just draw a line, but these are tubes. There's a network of tubes here, so that these tubes come very close to the cells. Now, these tubes, in fact, are very thin-walled, and therefore transfer can take place across these walls. And these, in turn, are the branches of thicker vessels, which in turn are branches of still thicker vessels. And the blood keeps flowing in these as a result of the action of the heart, which we can show like this, the pump. So this pumps the blood in one of the largest blood vessels that we have, which in turn divides into smaller branches and still smaller branches, and one branch of these goes to every part of the body, and within the organ, then it divides and subdivides into still smaller branches, so that, starting with a stem, there is a huge tree of these tubes getting smaller and smaller as they get closer to the cells. And once they are very close to the cells, once they are very close to the cells, they are very thin-walled, and transport can take place across them, and they bring fresh food and oxygen to these cells. Now, when the blood emerges from these capillaries, it has undergone a change. And we show that this change is the result of the oxygen having been removed, and therefore that's customary to show that in a bluish color. It's less red than the blood that went in, and this then again returns to the heart. And now it is pumped into the lungs. Where oxygen will be added to this, and the blood that will come out of the lungs will have this additional oxygen, and therefore, once again, it will be red. And now this blood has to return from here, from the lungs to the heart to be pumped again. So you can see blood entering this pump and leaving it, and it is entering this pump and leaving it. But then we don't have two hearts, we just have one heart. Whereas we seem to be needing two pumps. Sorry about breaking the heart into two pieces, but then we'll put it together now and see how within that one heart we actually have two pumps. Now this does look a bit like the heart, isn't it? And it has 4 chambers. The upper chambers are called the atria. So this is the right atrium, the left atrium. The chambers at the bottom are the ventricles, right ventricle and the left ventricle. And the blood has to enter and leave these chambers. So there are gaps. A gap here, a gap here, a gap here, and a gap here. And for convenience, let's draw a gap here and a gap here. Okay. So the arrangement is such that blood returns from the lungs after oxygen has been added to it. Here, from here, it is pumped to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it is pumped to the whole body. And after giving its oxygen to the cells of different parts of the body, it returns here. From here, it is pumped into the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle, it goes to the lungs. And then oxygen is added in the lungs. And this blood then returns here. So you can see, in fact, there are two pumps within one heart and a rather complex looking arrangement. But this is how the circulation takes place. And this circuit was first sort of worked out through some observations by William Harvey in 1628. That was just the beginning of the European Renaissance. And his ideas were quite contrary to what the prevailing ideas were. And therefore, he had to wait for 12 years before he could make his ideas public. He was afraid because so much was the fear of contesting authority and the testimony of the ancients, because still Europe had not got over the age of convention. And therefore, just to explain this little thing that I have explained within a few minutes, he had to write a book of 70 pages and wait for 12 years before making it public, to be more sure, and for the atmosphere to be receptive. And still he was quite afraid. That's what he mentioned in those 70 pages, that I have quite fear for myself, which means he might be attacked and prosecuted for saying something which is against convention. But anyway, so now you can see that this is how the blood moves. And to ensure that the blood keeps moving in the proper direction, there are valves here. So this will allow flow this way, but not in the opposite direction. And there are valves here. So you have valves between the atria and the ventricles, and you have valves between the two ventricles and the major blood vessels into which. So these valves will snap shut if the blood tries to flow in the opposite direction. Okay. Now let's look at this a little differently, the same arrangement. So let's start with the left ventricle. Now this left ventricle pumps its blood into a major blood vessel called the aorta, which then divides into branches, and these branches go to different parts of the body. Say some would go to the intestines, some would go to the legs, and so on. And some branches of the aorta would go to the head and neck region. So this now gets distributed all over the body. So this is going to the intestines. This is going to the legs and the feet. And this is going to the head and neck region. Now, after giving up its oxygen to all these parts of the body, the blood emerges. And now that it has given up its oxygen, we'll draw it in a different color. Now, this process is somewhat opposite of that. We saw the aorta dividing into finer and finer branches, whereas when the blood returns, then these veins through which it returns, they start merging into bigger and bigger veins. And finally, we have two big veins which return the blood to the heart, and they come back to the this part of the heart. So these two veins bring the blood back to the right atrium. And from the right atrium, it flows into the right ventricle. And from the right ventricle into the lungs, pumped into the lungs. And in the lungs, oxygen is added and carbon dioxide removed. And the result is that now blood is oxygenated, and this oxygenated blood then returns to the left atrium. And from the left atrium into the left ventricle, then into the aorta. So this is how it goes on. Now, the branches of the aorta are called arteries. And generally, the standard abbreviation is AA. And these are the veins. Not only are these called the arteries, but This is also called an artery, the pulmonary artery. Okay. And this vessel, which is, these are the veins, okay, coming from different parts of the body. And this blood vessel, which is carrying the blood from the lungs to the heart, is called the pulmonary vein. Okay. Now, one of the common impressions is that arteries carry oxygenated blood, generally called pure blood, and veins carry deoxygenated, that is blood from which oxygen has been removed, and that is impure blood. But here you can see that there is a vein that is carrying the so-called pure blood, and there is an artery which is carrying the so-called impure blood, pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein. So the real distinction is not the type of blood they carry, although largely it is true for these large number of arteries and veins, but the distinction is any blood vessel which into which the heart pumps the blood out. That is an artery, and the blood vessels which bring the blood back to the heart, that is a vein. So all the veins, all these blood vessels which are bringing deoxygenated blood back from different parts of the body to the heart, they are veins. The blood vessels which are bringing the blood from the lungs back to the heart, those are also veins, although the blood is oxygenated. In the same way, the blood vessels which pump the blood out of the heart to different parts of the body, those are arteries. But then the blood vessel which pumps the blood out of the heart to the lungs, that is also an artery. Okay. So whatever the heart pumps out, that goes on in an artery, and it returns to the heart through a vein. So the heart receives blood and gives away blood. It receives and pumps out. And that is the basis of the Indian name, the Hindi and Sanskrit name for the heart, Hridaya. It's a combination of Hri and Day. Hri is Hari, the one who takes away, and Day, Data, the divine, who gives. So the divine gives and the divine takes away. In the same way, the heart also gives and takes away. It does both these things. So that sort of is the, which means that the ancients had some idea that the heart is receiving the blood and then pumping it out. And that's how this name was given. And of course, in ordinary language, we also use this for a variety of emotions, like hearty congratulations and a hearty meal and so on and so forth. And the truth is coming straight from my heart and so on and so forth. So that's the distinction between arteries and veins. And then we have valves which ensure one-way flow through all this. But then it's not only the valves that are required. To make the blood flow, we also need a difference in the pressure. And the blood flows from a high pressure to a low pressure area. And let's just start with the, to talk about the left ventricle, which has just about the highest pressure that you see anywhere in the heart. And that is required, pump blood at a high pressure is required here in the left ventricle, because this blood has to travel all over the body. And therefore, to start with, it should get a really good push. In contrast, on the right side in the right ventricle, it has to go only to the lungs, a small network of blood vessels, and therefore the push required is not that hard. So in the left ventricle, gives a real hard push to the blood, and it gets into these, the big artery, and as it travels farther and farther away, gets into smaller and smaller blood vessels, the pressure keeps falling, as you can imagine. You can visualize that, so that by the time it reaches the capillaries, the pressure has fallen quite low, and by the time it comes out of the capillaries and flows into the vein, the blood the pressure is still lower, and so that by the time it returns to the right atrium, the pressure is almost negligible. It's a very low pressure. Now, to be able to receive this blood, which has returned from the whole body into the right ventricle, or to receive this blood, which has come from the lungs into the heart, into the atria, therefore, become low pressure areas. So these have a low pressure so that they can receive the blood. And to be able to receive, at that time, the ventricles should be relaxing. Because if the ventricle is relaxed, then only the pressure in the ventricles can be low. And during relaxation, the ventricular pressure falls to zero. So here at least there is some pressure building up because of the blood flowing in. And here there is a zero pressure during relaxation. And that's how the blood is able to flow from the atrium into the ventricle. And to make one last effort towards the pumping of the blood from the atria into the ventricles, the atria do contract a little bit towards the end of this flow from the atria to the ventricles. They contract a little bit. But then that contraction is not indispensable, which means that much of the blood flows passively as a result of here at least there being some pressure and some pressure continuing to build up because the atria are filling, they are receiving blood, and here their pressure being zero during relaxation. And therefore, because of this pressure differential, the flow continues, and it's only one last bit during which 20 to 30% of the blood that is pumped into the ventricle may be pumped in as a result of the atrial contraction. Why I'm emphasizing this is because there can be situations in which the atria do not have any effective contraction. But the heart can still continue to function because that is not critical. What is critical is that the ventricle should be able to contract properly. And how that happens is that when this blood flow continues into the relaxed ventricle, eventually the ventricular pressure will start rising, and here the pressure would start falling after that last ditch effort at pumping some blood as a result of atrial contraction. And the result is that now the pressure in the ventricle is higher than in the atria. The ventricles are full, the pressure has gone up, and therefore this valve will be snapped shut. This valve through which the blood is flowing from the atria into the ventricles. On the left side, it is called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. And now the ventricle is a closed cavity. It was closed on this side, and it was so far closed on this side when the ventricle was relaxing. And it remains closed because the pressure in the aorta is higher. Now that the ventricle is a closed cavity and it starts contracting, the pressure builds up to a level which is now higher than the aorta. And when that happens, this valve opens up. And when this valve opens up, the blood enters the aorta. And it will continue to flow till the pressure in the aorta is higher than the pressure in the left ventricle. And then this valve will be snapped shut. And then, once again, the ventricle is a closed cavity because this is shut. This was already shut earlier. And the result would be that as the blood continues to flow into the atria, the pressure here will build up, rise a little above the ventricular pressure, and come here. So the key thing is that the left ventricle, every time it's a closed cavity, if it contracts, the pressure builds up to a high level. And when it is a closed cavity and relaxes, the pressure falls steeply. Because you can imagine that if the volume remains the same, any chamber which will contract will have a steep rise in the pressure. And if that chamber with the same amount of blood relaxes, there will be a steep fall in the pressure. So that's why there's a huge fluctuation in the pressure in the ventricles. And we're talking mainly about left ventricle, where this fluctuation is really enormous. During contraction, it builds up to a level of about 120 millimeters of mercury. And during relaxation, it falls to 0 millimeters of mercury. So that much is the fluctuation. Now, during contraction, the pressure that we get is the systolic pressure. During relaxation, it is the diastolic pressure. But then, how about the aorta into which the blood is being pumped? Does that experience the same fluctuation? Only partly. Because when the pressure here is 120, it is pushing the blood into the aorta. The aortic pressure also becomes 120. But when the pressure eventually in the aorta becomes slightly higher than in the ventricle, the valve snaps shut. The pressure in the ventricle falls steeply to 0. In the aorta, it does not fall steeply to 0. It comes down at the most to 80 or so, something like 80. And the blood pressure that we measure is the pressure in the aorta and its bigger branches. Now, while traveling from the aorta into these bigger arteries, the pressure does not change much. The pressure changes only when it gets into smaller arteries. So that is why you find that the blood pressure is about 120 by 80. So this is the systolic pressure when the ventricle is contracting, the left ventricle is contracting, and this is the diastolic pressure, the pressure during the period when this left ventricle is relaxing. Its own pressure is falling towards zero, but the aortic pressure is not falling to zero. Now, how is this achieved? This is achieved because aorta and the bigger arteries are elastic arteries. So you can imagine it like this. Say this is an elastic chamber here. So the whole artery is elastic, but sort of to make understanding clear, what I'm doing, I've drawn an elastic balloon here. So the blood is pumped in here at 120. What will happen as a result of this is that this balloon will get distended. And it continues here at 120 and the balloon has got distended. Now, when the flow here stops, when the left ventricle, this valve is shut and the left ventricle is no longer in communication with the aorta, the pressure here stops falling. The pressure here will not fall to zero because what will happen is when the blood stops flowing, this balloon will start closing in on the blood that is within it. So it will, because it is elastic in nature. And the result is that as this balloon closes in on that blood, the blood will still continue flowing and there'll be still some pressure maintained in this vessel. So that's how during the relaxation of the ventricle during diastole, the arterial pressure in the arteries does not fall to zero, it falls to only about 80. And before it falls any further, the whole cycle is over. And now this 80 is below the pressure that builds up in the ventricle in its contraction. It can build up to 120, but the moment it goes a little above 80, say 82 or 83, this valve will open and will start pumping and will keep pumping at a pressure of 120, which had built up here, and that is the pressure which will be transmitted to the aorta. So it is because of the elasticity of these. But then by the time it has returned to the ventricles after going through all those smaller arteries and capillaries and so on, by that time it has fallen to almost zero, and that is how it returns here. And it's only because of the filling that the atrial pressure goes up. So in the atria, the pressure goes up primarily because of the filling with the blood. In the ventricles, the pressure rises and falls because of active contraction and relaxation. And this contraction and relaxation is taking place during certain phases when the ventricle is a completely closed cavity. So that's how there is a steep rise and a steep fall. So I try to sort of make you a little more familiar with the mechanisms behind some of these terms which are commonly used, like how much is the blood pressure and so on and so forth, and how this happens. So now you have some idea of how the blood pressure is about 120 by 80 and what it really means. So it is the pressure with which the blood is being pumped into the aorta. Now, another thing that you would have noticed is that when the atria are emptying the blood into the ventricle, at least towards the end of this process, they contract. And throughout this period, the left ventricle was relaxed, which means when the atria contract, the ventricle is relaxed so they can receive the blood. On the other hand, when the ventricle is pumping the blood out, at that time, the atria are relaxed. That is how they can receive the blood, which will be pumped again in the next cycle. So when the ventricles contract, the atria are relaxed, and when the atria contract, the ventricles are relaxed. So they don't contract simultaneously. Both the atria contract simultaneously, both the ventricles contract simultaneously, but the atria and the ventricles don't contract simultaneously. And that is important because if they contract simultaneously, what would happen is that the heart will completely sort of squeeze out blood from all its chambers, and then there'll be nothing. Then how will it fill up? So it is because of this alternation that when the atria contract, the ventricles are relaxed, that the ventricles can receive the blood and fill up. And when the ventricles empty that blood by contracting, that is the time atria relax so that they can receive blood returning from the lungs or different parts of the body, depending upon whether it is the right side or the left side. They can receive that blood, fill up, and get ready for the next phase of contraction when they'll fill the ventricles again. So this is another important thing, that the atria and the ventricles don't contract at the same time. Their contraction and relaxation alternate. Now, how is this type of alternation achieved? Let's try and understand that now. That alternation is achieved because the contraction in the cardiac muscle, as is true of also the other muscles in the body, is associated with a electrical activity. Minute currents, but all the same, it's electrical activity. And as this electrical impulse spreads through the muscle, the impulse is then followed by a mechanical action, that is contraction. That takes place also in the heart. Now, in case of the heart, the arrangement is such that if there is an electrical impulse in any part of the atria, it spreads to both the atria quickly. If there is an electrical impulse in any part of the ventricle, that also spreads quickly to both the ventricles. But the impulse does not spread from the atria to the ventricles or from the ventricles to the atria. That is ensured by having what is called the fibrous skeleton in the heart, which means that it is fibrous tissue, which not only gives shape to the heart and makes it firm, that's why it's called the skeleton, but that is the tissue which does not allow transmission of these electrical impulses. And therefore, an electrical impulse cannot travel from the atria to the ventricles and from the ventricles to the atria. That electrical impulse can spread either throughout the atria or throughout the ventricles. Yet, you need some sort of a transmission, otherwise how will rhythmic activity take place? So now, for that, there are two things which now we'll try and see. One is that how is the rate of the heart ensured that it is about 70 times a minute? And how is it that the impulse spreads to both the atria, and after a little delay, it spreads to both the ventricles. So there's a gap, so that the atria and the ventricles will not contract simultaneously. Now, the beginning of this electrical impulse is in a specialized tissue called the SA node or the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node or the SA node is in the right atrium, and the property of this SA node is that it discharges electrical impulses at a relatively fixed rate, rhythmically, on its own. When we say on its own or spontaneously, strictly speaking, nothing is spontaneous. There's always a reason behind it. But for all practical purposes, we can say that this just keeps discharging. It doesn't require any stimulus from outside to be able to discharge these impulses rhythmically and regularly. And this it can go on doing 70 times a minute for more than 70 years. Here's an example in front of you, whose SA node has been doing that for almost 75 years now. So it's remarkable that the heart, this activity continues, the heart continues to beat around 70 times a minute for almost 100 years in some people, or sometimes even more than 100, without getting tired. This itself is a remarkable feat, which should once again make us admire the divine who has created such a wonderful pump, which goes on working on its own as a result of the discharge of these impulses from the SA node on its own, apparently spontaneously. Now, this impulse originating here spreads throughout the atria and leads to contraction of both the atria simultaneously. But it doesn't spread to the ventricles because there is fibrous tissue guarding the junction of these atria and the ventricles. However, it has to spread to the ventricles. Otherwise, how will the ventricles contract? And for that, we have a special arrangement. Here, there is another similar thing at the junction of the atria and the ventricles, which is called the AV node. Now, the AV node does allow transmission across. But again, the property of the AV node is that it allows conduction only after a delay. So it spreads throughout the atria The atria contract simultaneously. When this impulse reaches the AV node allows transmission only after a delay. And you can understand this delay is important so that the ventricles will not contract at the same time. Now from here, this continues into what is called the bundle of His. And this bundle of His then divides into branches, the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch. And these bundle branches can transmit this impulse. So the transmission into this bundle and these bundle branches, the right and the left bundle branch, this transmission takes place after a certain delay. Once this delay has been overcome, then the transmission through these bundle and bundle branches is quick. And from here, it spreads to the muscles on both sides, ventricular muscle. That also is quick. And once it spreads to the ventricles contract simultaneously because there's quick transmission of impulse from these bundle branches into this. Now, that is a sort of beautiful arrangement here. And not only that, this also has a certain reserve in it. The reserve is that the SA node can discharge spontaneously. The AV node also has a potential, although potential remains hidden, the potential of discharging impulses rhythmically and spontaneously like the SA node. It not only allows delayed transmission, it also has a capacity to discharge spontaneously. Which means that if the SA node is not functioning, this can take over. And as we saw, the atrial contraction is not critical. It's the ventricular contraction which is critical. Atrial contraction is not critical for survival. It's only pumps 25 to 30% of all the blood that flows from the atria into the ventricles. More than 70% can flow on its own passively as a result of the pressure difference. So the atrial contraction is not critical. And therefore, even if the atria do not contract because the SA node is not discharging, this itself can take over and send. But then you'll say, how is it that normally it doesn't show that potential? Because the rate at which it discharges spontaneously lower than the SA node. See, SA node discharges at the rate of about 80 times a minute, AV node only at about 40 to 50 times a minute. You can imagine it like this. Suppose there's a train, which has not one but two engines. And the bogies behind it. Now, in the front are the two engines. And although steam engines are not common, but to show that these are different from the bogies, I'll show smoke coming out of them. So these are the two engines. Now, this engine is running at the speed of 80 kilometers per hour. And this engine is also running, but at a pace which will pull the train at 40 kilometers per hour. So this engine is, we are pressing the accelerator to such an extent that if this is working, the train will move at 80. And here we are pressing the accelerator in such a way, it will pull the train only up to the speed of 40 kilometers per hour. At what speed will the train move? 80 kilometers per hour, because that is the train. But suppose this engine fails. The train will not stop. The train will now start moving at 40 kilometers per hour. Right? So it's something like this that is possible here in the heart. And that is what this type of blockages in transmission or blockage in transmission from here throughout both the ventricles are different types of abnormalities which give rise to arrhythmias in the heart. The heart does not beat very rhythmically, but the person does not die immediately. So this is the broad sort of understanding of what arrhythmias are like in the heart, and things like that there's a heart block, first degree heart block, second degree heart block, third degree heart block, bundle branch block. So all these blockages mean some sort of a block in this conduction system. This entire system, SA node, AV node, bundle of His, bundle branches, right bundle branch, left bundle branch, all this together is called the conduction system of the heart, because it's conducting an impulse which normally originates in the SA node. It's transmitting that, conducting that throughout the heart in a way that it leads to a proper rhythmic contraction of the whole heart in such a way that both the atria contract simultaneously, and then after a little delay, both the ventricles contract simultaneously. Now, this electrical activity, then in turn, this electrical activity gives rise to it's an electrical activity which can be picked up also on the surface of the chest. This electrical activity of the heart can be picked up on the chest. And that is what gives us the electrocardiogram, the ECG. Okay. Now let's see what the different waves in the ECG are about. Now normally an ECG looks somewhat like this. Now this is the P wave. This is the QRS complex. And this is the T wave. Now the P wave corresponds to the atrial contraction. The QRS to the ventricular contraction. And the T wave to the ventricular relaxation. I'll ask, what about the atrial relaxation? Atrial relaxation wave is not seen because that coincides with more or less with the ventricular contraction, and it gets submerged in this big QRS complex. So we don't see the wave of atrial relaxation. So atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, and ventricular relaxation. And after ventricular relaxation will come soon after that the P wave, which will be the atrial contraction of the next cycle. So this is why the ECG looks a bit like this, and we will not go into this any further. If there are any questions at this point, we can take them up. But after that, what I will do is I'll go to a PowerPoint presentation, which will give you a little more realistic picture of how these structures actually look within the body. So any questions at this point?
Sometimes sports people or people who exercise a lot, they have that dark and thick veins. Is that good, bad? Is there something significant in the size of the veins, doctor?
Well, actually, it's exercising should not normally lead to thick veins. What you mean by thick veins is probably varicose veins, prominent veins in the legs. Is that what you mean?
No, I just have noticed that people who go to the gym a lot or exercise a lot, and this question actually comes on behalf of my daughter, who's a sports person. She keeps thinking that thick veins are good, whereas I didn't have that impression at all. I just wanted to check. According to her, it indicates fitness, but I did not know for sure. So I'm trying to understand if there is any indication. So people who exercise strenuously, they seem to have thicker veins on their arms, especially. And if it's an irrelevant question, please ignore it.
No, I'm not sure if exercise has anything to do with it. We all tend to have veins which are less prominent or more prominent. That seems to be an inbuilt characteristics. Nurses usually find very easy to get the blood sample from one patient, but not so easy from another. That is because how prominent their veins are. If maybe exercise makes the person remain not get overweight, that will certainly keep the veins prominent. If that same person puts on a lot of weight, those veins will be less prominent. So that you can understand. So it has probably more to do with the fitness has anything to do with it. It probably means that the person has not put on much weight. There's not too much extra subcutaneous tissue, and therefore the veins are quite prominent. What happens in exercise actually is something which we'll talk about in the next class, that how a person adapts to exercise, what are the changes that a person goes through as a result of regular heavy exercise, and why some people who take heavy exercise regularly may occasionally get a heart attack. This has become a little, once again, come to the front after Raju Srivastava's death. So why this type of cases keep happening off and on from time to time. So these are things which we'll discuss in the next class.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
Any other question?
Sir, I had a question. So when your heart stops and you do CPR, what happens to these signals? I mean, how does the heart get activated again when you perform that CPR?
Yes, when you thump the chest to sort of make the heart start again, if it has stopped, that helps by just providing a mechanical stimulus. And because sometimes that helps in restarting the heart, but that is only sort of in an emergency when you do not have much facilities available. Otherwise, what is done in the hospitals is to give a strong electrical shock to the heart, and it's hoped that after that, the heart will restart again. Because when the heart has stopped, it has not really completely stopped. It has gone into what is called a fibrillation, which means a low-level disorganized contraction, which is ineffective. And one can restore that rhythm sometimes either through CPR or through a strong electric shock.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned that these electrical signals that run within the muscles of the heart, is it our brain who's sending that impulse?
That's a good question. As I said, I mean, this is apparently spontaneous, which means that the brain is not involved in sending this. And that is why even in an unconscious person or this heart continues to beat. When the brain function is almost gone, even then the heart may continue to beat. That's because spontaneous. However, it can be modulated, which means the rate can go up and the rate can go down. And in that, the nervous system and the endocrine system both come in, because the requirements of the rate at which and the force with which the heart should be beating, they keep changing from time to time. And therefore, this modulation should be possible. And as everywhere, all this modulation of function or regulation or control, so that in spite of the changes in the requirements of the body, the environment of each cell still remains favorable for survival. That is ensured by having regulatory systems which can step up or step down the activity of organs like the heart and the lungs and so on. So now how the cardiovascular activity is regulated, that also we'll take up in the next class.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So if there are no other questions, then we can, again, I will share the screen again, and hopefully you'll again have another opportunity after the PPT is over. It's only a short PPT with a few slides. These YES courses and the rest of the YES project is a part of the 150th birth anniversary celebrations of Sri Aurobindo and the 50th anniversary of India's independence. Before I go further, the realistic pictures, anatomical pictures that you see in this presentation are from this book, Principles of Anatomy and Physiology, the 10th edition, which was brought out by Tortora and Grabowski. Tortora is the person who has been throughout there from the first edition till the last. Probably the latest edition is the 14th edition, but these pictures are from the 10th edition, which was jointly brought out by Tortora and Grabowski. Let me start with in this short little poem by a 19th century physician who practiced in the Boston area in the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes. No rest that throbbing slave may ask, forever quivering o'er his task, while far and wide a common jet leaps forth to fill the woven net, which in unnumbered crossing tides, the flood of burning life divides, then kindling each decaying part, creeps back to find the throbbing heart. So this is about the heart and the circulation, as you can see. The heart is like that slave that never asks for any rest, just continues to throb. And as it does so, it sends jets of blood far and wide. This blood travels through a network, the woven net as he has called it, and there are an unnumbered of crossings because of the various branches and the hurdles apparently that it goes through, as a result of which the pressure falls to almost zero by the time it has returned to the heart. But as it is doing so, it supports the burning life. Burning life, because the process of life is somewhat similar to combustion. Like, if you burn fuel, you get heat energy with the help of fuel and oxygen. Here also in the body, we have fuel in the form of our food, and we use oxygen to get energy. And in both cases, the waste product is carbon dioxide. So the process of life is often compared to combustion or burning. But all the same, it is a very regulated burning, so that there is no real fire, only a little bit of heat dissipates. The rest of the energy can be used for the processes of life. And this is possible because all the energy available from the fuel is not released in one installment, it is released in small pockets, little bit at a time, so that it can be used properly. And after it has taken care of each decaying part, which means part which was starving for oxygen and food to be brought, after that, the blood finds its way back to the throbbing heart to be pumped once more. Now, this is the entire arterial system and the venous system, shown in two pictures for convenience, but actually the same person will have both the arterial and the venous systems. This is the chest, the heart here, and the lungs on the two sides, and the on the outside we have this bony cage with these ribs and the muscles between these ribs. And you can see this blood vessels, a big blood vessel coming out of the heart, going towards the head, the carotid arteries, and blood returning from the head through these veins. This is the anterior view of the heart. Anterior means the front view. So when you look at it from the front, this is how the heart looks, and a bit of fat here, and this big aorta, and the blue-colored vessels are the veins that are bringing the blood back to the right atrium, and this blue is the pulmonary artery, which is taking the blood from the right ventricle towards the lungs, and so on. This is the posterior view. That is when you look at the heart from the back side. You'll get a little more clear view of certain things and less clear view of others, which is quite understandable. This is the pulmonary artery bringing the blood from the right ventricle, and these are the various veins bringing the blood from the different parts of the body. And this is the aorta taking the oxygenated blood to different parts of the body from the left ventricle. Now, this is when you cut open the heart along its length. This is the frontal section. So you can see the inside of the heart. And you can see now a bit of this fibrous skeleton, which I was talking about. And this is where the AV node is, and these are probably the bundle branches and so on. So you can see both the chambers of the heart, the right ventricle, so right atrium and the right ventricle, left atrium and the left ventricle. And along with that, one more thing you'll see is the valves. These are the valves between the atria and the ventricles. And here are the valves guarding the opening into the pulmonary artery and into the aorta. Aortic valve will be somewhere here, it's probably hidden. But anyway, the important thing that I wanted to show you was that these valves have these fibers extending, and at the end of these fibers, there is again a small little muscle called the papillary muscles. These fibers have at their end a muscle which is the papillary muscle. Now, why muscle, this little muscle here? That is required because when the ventricle contracts, if the result will be that the distance between the valve and this attachment to the ventricle will be reduced. If this gets reduced, the valve will get flabby. Now, that is the time when we do not want the blood to flow back into the atria. These are the atrioventricular valves, valves separating the atria from the ventricles. So you do not want the blood to flow back into the atria as a result of ventricular contraction. You want it to go only to the aorta. Now, what happens is when the ventricle contracts, these muscles also contract. The result is that the distance between the atrioventricular valve and the ventricular wall does not reduce in spite of the ventricular contraction. If it does not reduce, the valve does not get flabby and the valve still remains tight. So that all that wisdom is packed into the heart. Now this is coronary circulation, that is the blood vessels which supply the heart. So right at the beginning of the aorta, there are these branches which are called the coronary arteries, which supply the heart. And like from other organs, the blood returns from the heart through these veins called the cardiac veins. So these are the coronary arteries and the cardiac veins shown here. And you might say that, well, the heart itself is full of so much blood. Then why does it need a blood supply of its own? That has been sort of beautifully explained through a simile by Deepak Chopra. He says that the people who work in the bank are surrounded by money all the time, and yet they need a salary for themselves. So that's sort of one way to understand why the heart itself needs a blood supply, although it is full of blood all the time. And to put it more sort of scientifically, why it is required is because you have the entire thickness. And we have seen that the oxygen has to reach every cell of the body, including every cell in the cardiac muscle. And for that to happen, it is essential that because the blood in the cavity of the heart will not be able to travel through all that thickness of the muscle and reach near every cell. So as in the other parts of the body, we need a network which will take the blood in close proximity to every cell within the wall of the heart, every cell that constitutes the cardiac muscle. Of course, the heart is not all muscle, but it's predominantly muscle, as you can see. And again, the heart is not just kept bare like this. It has a thin coating, the serous pericardium, and at a little distance from it is a thicker covering called the fibrous pericardium. And the fibrous pericardium tethers it in proper position, keeps it in proper shape so that it remains at a fixed place in the chest. And the serous pericardium forms another little covering all over the heart. Between these two, the fibrous and the serous pericardium is again a small bit of fluid. That fluid acts as a lubricant so that the movement of the heart is friction-free. So all this is also a part of the structure of the heart and the structures around it. Now, you'll find this topic discussed in the 4th chapter, Blood on the Move, of this book, The Human Machine. And much greater detail in these two books, Fundamentals of Physiology and Understanding Medical Physiology. And this book not only has beautiful pictures about Aurora's principles of anatomy and physiology, it also has beautiful text. It's about 1,000 pages long, but it's an extremely well-written book, and that's how it has stood the test of time. Now it is in the 14th edition. And this is a picture of Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch, the place where I live and work. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to write to us on yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there. Any questions?
Yes, there are two questions in the chat box. I'll just read them. The first question is, what causes nosebleeds?
Well, one of the causes is children, particularly poking their nose and injuring the nasal mucosa. But apart from that, it could sometimes happen apparently without any reason. When scientifically trained doctors like me say that apparently without any reason, it's just hiding our ignorance, because everything has to have a reason. And you might have heard this folk knowledge in India. And probably Ayurveda would support that. We can ask maybe Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya, who will be speaking tomorrow, that garmi se hota hai. It means it indicates excessive heat in the body. So maybe that could be one of the things. But then normally it is mild and stops on its own. All little pressure and some cold water is all what is required. But once in a while, nosebleeds can get serious and might need the attention of an ENT doctor who will put in a packing and all that in the nose.
The
Any
next
other-
question is, yes. How does sodium affect blood pressure? Why are people with high BP told to reduce salt in diet?
Yes, it's because the contraction of smooth muscle, whether it is in the heart or whether it is in the arterial wall, involves an exchange of electrolytes across the cell. And that is what in turn leads to electrical activity. And therefore, high sodium levels can be associated with blood pressure. Having said that, it doesn't happen in everybody, which means there are people who are salt-sensitive hypertension and there are people who are not sensitive to salt. And this seems to be a genetic trait. Those who have a salt-sensitive hypertension are told to avoid salt. Another important thing to remember is that all of us do need some salt also. And this is ensured by some salt or sodium. When we say salt, we are meaning sodium. Of course, there are many salts. Potassium chloride is also a salt. But we mean sodium chloride. Either enough of sodium salts in the food that we take, which means that whether a person has salt-sensitive hypertension or salt-insensitive, or whether a person has no hypertension at all, if this person will stop taking salt, the person will not suffer from salt deficiency. How the other way around is possible? If the person takes too much salt, much more table salt than is even ordinarily taken by most people, then this person, in spite of being not salt sensitive, might develop high blood pressure, which means that it's all a question of challenge and response. So if the person is very sensitive, even the normal amount of table salt might give him high blood pressure. If he is insensitive, it will need much more, which means we should know which are the foods which everybody should preferably avoid, so that sodium intake is not so much that the person gets hypertension, even if the person is not salt sensitive. And those foods are things like pickles, chutneys, papad. These are the high salt foods. So these are the foods to avoid, take as little as possible to reduce the sodium intake. And of course, table salt, if it is used in vegetables and dals, etc., should be kept on the lower side. How much lower? That, actually one gets used to. There are households in which they put quite a bit more, and if they put a little less, there's a complaint that today the salt is less. There are some households who put only that much, which feeds less to this family, and they get used to it. And of course, people can get used to also eating food entirely without salt. Of course, if they are very keen that one should get the right taste from food, then they can add some potassium chloride. That is what the doctors tell, that you have to take a salt-free diet, but then add a little potassium chloride. It will give you not the same taste, but compensate partly for the absence of salt. That reminds me of an anecdote. When Sri Aurobindo had just gone to Pondicherry, he had only 4 or 5 young persons staying with him who were with him in the freedom struggle. And these young boys went for games in the evening, and he did not. He was not a very sports type of a person. So he stayed at home with doing all his scholarly work, reading and writing and so on. Now, these young boys used to treat him like a guru, so he was not asked to cook the food. They used to cook the food for him, and he wanted to have an early dinner. So what they used to do was to cook the dinner, then go for their games. Sri Aurobindo will eat in their absence, and when they came back, they came and had the dinner. One day it so happened that when they returned from sports and had their dinner, they found that there was only one vegetable that they had made. There was not much money, living from hand to mouth those days, soon after 1910, when Sri Aurobindo went to Pondicherry. So when these young boys returned from sports one day, they found there was only one vegetable they had made, and that vegetable had no salt at all. So the next day, they asked Sri Aurobindo, did you find anything wrong with the food? He said, no. Then they told him we had forgotten to add salt. And his answer was very interesting. He said, just as salt has a taste, saltlessness also has a taste.
Question: why doctors advise person to take salt with low blood pressure when they feel dizzy?
It's just the opposite logic, that if the person has low blood pressure, maybe extra salt will help him. It doesn't always help. What actually this person is, first thing, don't worry, because high blood pressure is a problem. By and large, low blood pressure is not a problem. The second thing is that this low blood pressure creates a minor, reversible, acute problem when you change the posture. Because, when we shift the posture from the lying down to sitting or sitting to standing, the blood has to be pumped more against gravity, because in lying down, the gravity is not in action, so less force is required. When we stand, maximum force is required to pump the blood to the upper parts of the body. Now, this is automatically achieved within a few seconds. There are regulatory mechanisms, again, some of which we shall see in the next class, which ensure that when we change the posture, these regulatory mechanisms ensure that the blood will continue to flow satisfactorily even after the change of posture, and we normally don't notice it. But in these people whom normally the blood pressure is on the lower side, when they change the posture, it is quite possible that the blood flow to the upper parts of the body may drop suddenly when they shift from, say, lying down to standing, and that's how they may feel dizzy and may faint. So the precaution to be taken is to do it in steps, not straight away from lying down to standing, but from lying down to sitting, sit for a while, and then from sitting to standing. And if it is so severe that you still feel fainting, then keep something close to the bed, hold that while shifting from sitting to standing. This applies not only to people who have low blood pressure, it applies also to elderly people. Like every other function in the body, with aging, these regulatory mechanisms can also become a little weaker. So an elderly person is also advised not to shift the posture suddenly, and shift it in steps, and have something handy to hold while shifting from even sitting to standing, so that if there is a dizziness, you can again sit back on the bed without falling. And now this has application also in the yogic postures. And sometimes, some people find that, say, in Surya Namaskar, when they are going from, say, Padahastasana to the next one, which is just standing up and raising the limbs, they can have a dizzying spell during that. Or say from lying down, they come to the standing posture in any posture, say from after lying down postures, suppose they have to do standing postures after that. Or even say if they are shifting from the Vajrasana to Ustrasana. So in Vajrasana, after Vajrasana, they have done Shashankasana, in which the head went completely down. So no gravity was required. If after that they suddenly come up to Vajrasana and then go to Ustrasana and stand on their knees, again they might get a dizzying spell, which means that all these movements have to be done a little slowly, giving time to the body to adapt and adjust. That's all what is required. Then this dizzying spell will not be there. There's a chat question which has suddenly appeared. Will you be discussing a few cardiovascular diseases? Yes, I will. In the next session, we'll talk about the coronary artery disease and high blood pressure, the two major common diseases of the cardiovascular system. There's an integrated approach to health sciences. We are not dividing it into anatomy and physiology. So there were some references to diseases even today. Next time, the focus will be more on disease, but then you will keep getting reminders of anatomy and physiology as and when. So it's a totally integrated approach. And of course, integrating it also with the spirituality and yoga. That is the type of synthesis we are trying to achieve through these sessions.
There are no more questions in the chat box. So in case anybody wants to ask, they can unmute and ask. Or maybe then, if there are no more questions, we can end today's session. So thank you everyone for joining in once again. And just one announcement, tomorrow we will have a guest session by Dr. Baswati Bhattacharya. She'll be talking on concept of health and diseases in Ayurveda. So we can just end today with a few moments of silence. Thank you once again.